Welcome to CSIS Online. The way we bring you events is changing, but we'll still present live analysis and award-winning digital media from our Dracopolis Ideas Lab. All on your time, live or on demand. This is CSIS Online.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dan Rundy, and I hold the Schreier Chair here at CSIS. I'm also Senior Vice President here, and I'm really delighted to be joined today by former Undersecretary of State Keith Krach. He was Undersecretary of State for Energy, Economic Growth, and the Environment, and is just a really an important voice in many of the global challenges that we face today. In his former role, Undersecretary Krach, goes by Keith, led U.S. diplomatic initiatives to expedite economic growth, improve energy security, and protect the environment. Keith's signature achievement is the creation of the Clean Network Alliance of Democracies, which now includes 60 countries representing 2/3 of the world's global GDP and dozens of the world's leading companies. Prior to his diplomatic role, Mr. Krach had a 42-year career in the private sector and was chairman, CEO, and president of DocuSign. He also co-founded Ariba, where he was also chairman and CEO, and he served as chairman of the board of trustees of Purdue University. So he's had a fabulous business career, and then he decided to give back to public service. He was confirmed 100-0 as Undersecretary of State for Economic Affairs. He's a true bipartisan public servant. Really, it's just really great to have you, Keith. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Dan. I really appreciate that, and I appreciate your overly generous introduction too.
But Keith, talk about how did you get the call to public service? You were not. I don't think you were really looking for it. I mean, you were doing your business work. You'd been the CEO of one Fortune 500 company, and then you became CEO of another Fortune 500 company. How did this happen?
Well, it's when I was running DocuSign, and at that point, we probably had about 500 million unique users. We were in every major country except China. And so it was time to look at that. And I went on a 2-week listening trip. And I've been going to China since 1981. I'm actually a lover of Chinese history and culture. My little twins go to the Chinese American school. And but on this trip, it was different. I had a chance to meet with 5 of the 7 Politburo members. I was able to see their drone swarm technology. It was the first time I heard about the Belt Road Initiative. It looked like a military supply chain to me. They kept telling me to download 10 cent. And while I was over there, I was thinking, the guys with the best technology win the war. I wonder if the folks in Washington know about this. So about a week later, I went out to Washington. I virtually didn't know anybody. I'd never been involved in politics. I've always run my companies politically neutral. I knew one person, and as I was talking about this, they said, "Have you ever thought about serving your country?" And I said, "Well, that's a dream I never knew I had." And I said, "I'd be honored." They said, "Can you move?" I go, "I can move anywhere in the world." And that's when they sent me to the State Department, and they gave me the charge to develop and operationalize global economic security strategy that will maximize national security, drive economic growth, and combat economic aggression. And it was one of the greatest experience, probably the greatest experience of my life. And, I've been blessed with the American dream, and to be able to pay back to the country that has given me so much and given my family so much. It was a true honor.
So you weren't in it for the bucks to go back into public service, right? Can we both, you didn't need the money, you didn't need it. You were giving back, but you brought a lot of really interesting expertise and experience to the role. What principles from the private sector were applicable in your role at the State Department for both kind of doing your job and also looking at some of the strategic issues you faced?
Sure. I would put it into 3 buckets. The first one would be what I would affectionately call economic warcraft or economic statecraft, because in Silicon Valley, the objective of the game is to build the category king, be like a DocuSign, like an Ariba, because when you do that, you get 80% of the resources and 80% of the market cap. And a lot of those principles apply in terms of economic statecraft. And, you know, some of the things you understand that particularly in the technology fight in a rapidly changing market, leadership is not defined by size. It's defined by momentum. Everybody wants to skate to where the puck is. And the ultimate currency is speed. And, you know, I understand it's not the big that eats the small, it's the fast that eat the slow. The second area of principle is, I would say, in the leadership area. And that is, it's all about building a high performance team. I always say the organization with the best team wins. I actually brought about 12 folks from the private sector, very accomplished executives, a diverse team. I believe that diversity of thought is the catalyst of genius. And I also believe that in order to get that team to work together, you need three things. You need a noble cause, which in the government, federal government, is national security. There's no higher noble cause. You know, in the business world, we would say we need an enemy. You don't say that at the State Department. You say an adversary. And we certainly have one in the Chinese Communist Party, because they've just become so aggressive. The third thing you need is a plan. And the way we've always developed the companies and what we used at the State Department was the thing I affectionately call the playbook. And the playbook is your vision, your mission, your values, your team rules, your strategy, and your long-term, all boiled down to execution. And that's really that. The third part is the business strategy. So we used a lot of those business strategies. A big one is building a network and the power of the network effect. And there's 4 ways to build a network. I won't get into all of that, but we used every single one of those. And then obviously a big part of it is having a well-developed integrated strategy, and utilizing concepts like strategic positioning, because the reason you do that is to deposition your competitors. The reason you do that is to set traps for them. And the definition of that strategic positioning, the value of it is your position vis-a-vis your opponent. So we used all that. The other thing that really came into play too is I have so many relationships with so many global CEOs. And, one of the things I said in my Senate confirmation hearing, they asked me what would be my approach to the China challenge. And I said, I'd harness the US's 3 biggest areas of competitive advantage. And that is further strengthen our relationship with our allies and our friends. And number 2, leverage the innovation and resources of the private sector. And then number 3, amplify the moral high ground of democratic values. And that's what we did.
Amen. It's great. I met a number of folks on your team, both the foreign service and civil service that you partnered with, but also many of the folks you brought with you. There's some really fabulous professionals at the State Department, career folks, but also you brought on some really excellent people with you. So I 100% agree with that. I attest to that. I dealt with a lot of your colleagues that you brought.
And, Dan, that was one of the keys, is that we did with the private sector guys. We teamed them up with the foreign service officers and the civil servants. And it was a mutual love affair. And, I think we will always take with us, when you look at these career officers, these guys are focused on that noble cause. They work their tails off. They have to rotate every 3 years. They have to take dangerous assignments. They're principle driven. They're professional, regardless of what the politics are that's going on. And you know what I tell all my friends back in Silicon Valley? I said, if you see a career foreign service officer, or if you see a civil servant, you do the same thing you do when you see somebody who served in the military. You thank them for their service, because our country wouldn't run without them.
I 100% agree. I always do that too, actually. Thanks for saying that. Whenever I meet someone who's done long-term federal government service, I always thank them for their service. Also, actually, Keith, that's, also our allies. When I meet members of the armed services of Canada or Australia, for example, I always thank them for their service because to your point about allies, I mean, we are, we're not a little bit sort of like in that film, It's a Wonderful Life, like every person's a success that they got friends. If the United States has got allies, we're going to be okay. And so we need to hug our allies close and treat them well. And so I just always think we can't ever take that for granted because the big challenges in the world require friends and allies. And so I so agree with your points about allies and innovation in the private sector and amplifying the moral high ground and this issue of thanking folks for their service.
You're absolutely right. In the federal government, my position is known as the E. And so we had our E team. And as we would go around the world or we go to private sector, we'd make them a virtual member of the E team. I present them with the challenge coin. I say, you're now a member of the United States State
Department. I love it.
You're 4-star, in the State Department. And, that's what it's all about. And building those trusted relationships. And you're so right about the allies. They're just so critical.
Oh, my word. So talk about the clean network. I actually think, given your background in technology, having been running 2 tech companies, I mean, you were kind of got involved in sort of the first inning of like the first tech wave with Ariba. I mean, that was an enormous company in the mid to late 90s. And then DocuSign, which everybody uses DocuSign, right? So you know all about technology and tech and why it's so critical and like how if we're gonna win the future, we got to win the tech competition. So talk about what is the clean network? Why does it matter? Yeah. And how should the Biden administration think about the clean network?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So the mission was to build this alliance of democracies, right? And also private sector companies. And as you mentioned, we ended up having 60 like-minded countries representing 2/3 of the world's global GDP, 200 telcos, and a whole host of clean countries. So if you look at what the objectives for the clean network, there were 3. The first one was to defeat the Chinese Communist Party's master plan to dominate 5G. And if you remember, a year ago, I mean, it looked like Huawei was unstoppable. And so our job was to turn the tide on that and also enable U.S. entrants to enter in the market, which indeed has happened. And the second one was to deliver a first really verified model for competing with China Inc. And the great news is, and particularly I think for the Biden administration, is that it's created a model of success. We had 10 essential elements that would make up what we considered the critical factors and make it an enduring, repeatable model. And that's in all kind of areas from, we extended it to clean cloud, clean apps, clean underwater cable, I foreshadowed, clean drones, clean Internet of Things, clean currency. Also with the Blue Dot network, clean infrastructure with clean finance, and then with clean minerals and clean energy, we had the ERGI initiative. So the same formula worked. And then the third objective was really to provide that beachhead and that strategic foundation. So really provide a head start on this. And I think that's a great legacy that we can leave the incoming team. And it really seems like that they're embracing it. And it really fits President Biden's and Secretary Blinken's strategy in terms of alliance of democracies. President Biden wrote about it in Foreign Policy magazine last year. And one of the quotes Secretary Blinken is, hey, look, if we have our alliance of democracies, we can get 50% of the world's GDP. We actually got 66%. So I think really all of that applies, and it's just so critical. And the underlying strategic positioning is exactly what I said in my confirmation hearing. It's about those democratic values. because if you look at what China Inc. had been doing, is that they had been using principles like integrity, transparency, reciprocity, respect for rule of law, respect for property of all kinds, respect for sovereignty of nations, respect for the planet, respect for human rights, respect for labor. And they were using those against us for their competitive gain. In other words, in an economic warcraft, statecraft, business world, if you don't have to be transparent, if you don't have to be reciprocal, if you could steal people's intellectual property, you've got a competitive advantage. What we ended up doing is we emphasized that trust aspect, those trust principles. So in essence, what we did is, and we said it's principle based. To be on the clean network, you have to pledge and live by those trust principles. So we actually did a jujitsu move, and we flipped China Inc. on their back by using those principles that they had been using against us, against them. We, in essence, weaponized those trust principles, which make up the freedoms we're trying to protect. And it's really kind of simple. But that was the beauty of the strategic position about trust, because I'd say in my first 60 bilaterals, with my foreign counterparts, foreign ministers, economic ministers, finance ministers, deputies, I'd be in a meeting with them and I go, hey, how's it going with China? They go, well, they're a very important trading partner. And then they look both ways and they go, but we don't trust them. And that clicked in my mind. Like at DocuSign, I would stand up in our user conference. I go, hey, we're not in the software business. We're in the trust business. We have people's most important documents. And all I know is that trust is the most important word in any language, because trust is the basis of every relationship, personal, business, otherwise. You do business with people you trust. You partner with people you trust. You buy from people you trust. You vote for people you trust. And they didn't have that. And that was their weakness. And one of the other things, Dan, I really discovered too, is that elephant in the room was the Chinese Communist Party's intimidation, retaliation. People were, countries and companies were terrified of that, against the retaliation. And all the examples from Norway to Korea, to the NBA. And what the Clean Network did is it not only exposed their biggest weakness in terms of trust, but it provided a security blanket. So in other words, there's strength in numbers and there's power in unity. There's power in unity and solidarity. So in other words, you can't retaliate against all companies, all countries, all at once. And I think that's the magical part of it. And I think that's a great opportunity that lies ahead. And I really believe this is the magic formula for competing with China's economic aggression and their unfair practices.
Let me just press a little bit more on the Huawei stuff and sort of the telecom stuff. Could you just kind of project out a year or two or three, and where do you think we're going to be a couple of years from now on the telecoms conversation?
Yeah. So if you look where we got the authorities for 5G, it was about a year ago. And at that point, Huawei had just announced they had 91 5G contracts around the world, 47 of them in Europe. They were going to run the table. They looked unstoppable. Nancy Pelosi at the Munich Security Conference, she got asked a question by somebody from the Chinese, and she said, look, it's a question. Choose between autocracy or democracy. And by the time we were done, they probably have less than a dozen or 2 dozen 5G contracts. So, and one of the key things about neutralizing Huawei was that they created a pricing umbrella that was really low because they were subsidizing, they stole the intellectual property. Their R&D was being subsidized. The Chinese foreign ministry was their sales force. And so what you didn't see is you didn't see new entrants coming in, like the big guys, like Microsoft or like Dell or Cisco or the startups. Now they're coming in. And a Cowen report just got issued last week that it talked about how all these companies now are coming to this market of 5G because we lift that pricing umbrella, which really allows them to make profit. There's also, if you look at what I would call 6.0, people talk about this thing called O-RAN. It's basically interoperability because up to this point, Huawei is a complete stack. So they have the entire system moved to two. If you make these components interoperable, now that really plays to United States' strength and rapid ability, innovation, all these startups that can specialize. It's a great analogy for it is the PC market. When that first Apple PC came out, everything was integrated together, the operating system, the applications, the hardware. And then when Microsoft came out with the DOS operating system, it really opened it up. It got much more competitive, prices dropped. IBM, Compaq, HP, all these guys got involved in the hardware application. So that's I think how we see that future. Now, what is critical about 5G is more than just smartphone. It is about utility grids, power generation systems, sanitation systems, manufacturing processes, Internet of Things, and the world's critical communications. It's also key for closing that digital divide as well. So this was a really, really a strategic effort, and it's really the first government-led initiative, the Clean Network, that actually defeated China Inc. And I think it's really important because it gives people hope, and I could really see that coming into the government.
So you're Keith, you're optimistic. Say 18 months from today, when I have you back on, say, let's save the date and let's have you back on in 18 months. We're going to be in a much better place on sort of, let's call it the telecoms conversation because of these changes that were started 12 or so months ago, and highly likely because of the very strong bipartisan consensus are going to be carried through. We're going to be in a much better place because of technological innovation, interoperability. We're going to be in a much better place.
Yeah, and I really see that. And, if you look at the heart of the global economic security strategy that we developed, and obviously the Clean Network was just a component of that, there were three pillars. The first is turbocharge our economic competitiveness. So that I would look at that as from an offensive standpoint. And, a couple of the things we did, we put together and really worked with senators on both sides of the aisle to get access to more capital. One of those is the Endless Frontiers Act. And we worked with Senator Schumer and Senator Young on that. And that's a $100 billion research fund that we showed we could get up to probably about $500 billion with a private sector match and our closest technological allies. We also came up with a thing in that plan well over a year ago called the Techno Democracy 12. So working with those, you look at that as a subset of the Clean Network, and that provides great incentive for them. We also did the same thing with regard to semiconductors for the CHIPS Act when we onshored TSMC. So there are a lot of things like that. The second key area is safeguard America's assets. So that's protecting not only our IP and our technology, but our financial markets. And China's been taking advantage of that to the extent where the average American citizen is unknowingly financing China's military machine and financing their surveillance state and financing things like genocide that are going on in Xinjiang. And then the third pillar was, of course, to form that network of trusted partners. So that's in essence that. So I'm optimistic. It's not gonna be easy. But if there's anything I've learned, you can have the greatest strategy in the world, but if you can't execute, you'll fail every time. You could have an okay strategy, but if you can out execute everybody else, you're going to win. So it's going to boil down to execution. And to be honest, that's why the Clean Network was so successful. And I think one of my observations, Dan, in coming into the United States government is that there's a big gap between policy and execution. It was like we were saying, you can have a great strategy, but once you get punched in the mouth, it kind of goes out the window, if you're a boxer. And so this has been battle hard, and to understand move, counter move. And there were a lot of moves and counter moves in this 5G competition that we got bloodied in the ring in over the last year.
So, I've done 700 or 800 Zoom calls since March the 12th of 2020. I'm sure you've done more than that, but at least 800 Zoom calls. And I have sort of 4 deep thoughts from my 800 or so Zoom calls. One of which is whatever your social capital was on March the 12th is kind of sort of what your social capital is today, because it's hard to meet people in person. No, you can though Zoom helps a little bit, but you know what I mean? Like it's much harder to connect with people and network, and you know what I mean? But one of them is that the other 2 other deep thoughts related to this clean networks thing, and also to a point I'm going to get to, is there's been more e-government, e-commerce, distance learning, and digital payments in the last 60 weeks than in the last 60 years. And if you want to have modernity in the future, you're going to need water, toilets, literacy, electricity. I'm going to say digital. I'm not going to say 5G because of what you were saying earlier about ORAN or 6th generation. We're going to need digital. And this is not just in the West. This is across the world. This is in Africa. This is Latin America. This is Southeast Asia. This is coming. And this gets to my point about a digital divide. And you referenced it earlier. This digital divide that I'm referring to, it's going to be closed either by the West or somebody else, because there's just, now that if we're all being digitally transformed, so is everybody else, and the publics are just going to demand this. So what do we need to do? Some of this is about getting sort of the alliances right, and some of the work that you're describing, the clean networks and execution. Talk about what's going to take to close this global digital divide over the next 5 to 10 years.
Well, it's beginning to close really fast in terms of accelerating things along the technology line. And as we were traveling the world during COVID, I mean, we went to 40 countries in the fall. I mean, I still knock on wood that our team didn't get it as we were traveling everywhere. It is a big part of that value proposition was particularly like in rural areas or low income areas or, around the world. And that was one of the things that we did in the Clean Network, because the original strategy was going around the world pounding on the table and saying, don't buy Huawei. And we came up with a novel idea, and we just said, why don't we treat them like a customer? The customer's always right to have a value proposition. So a key part of that value proposition, Dan, was closing that digital divide. Now, there's an issue with regard to, I would call it China's great one-way firewall, where all of the data comes in,
right,
but none comes out. And then all the propaganda goes out, but the truth does not come in. So what they've erected is kind of a splinter net, if you will. Well, they want the best of both worlds, right? The one way. And that was one of the things in terms of the Clean Network and our trust tenets. So what we said was the Clean Network is not, democracies against China. By the way, any country can come on the Clean Network. It doesn't exclude any country forever, anything like that. You just have to live by those trust principles and your behavior. Now, if you steal intellectual property, if you don't have reciprocal data flows, if you don't have rule of law, then you're not part of those principles. So what it does is it puts countries like China in a catch-22, because they're either going to miss out on this big market, or they've got to change their rules. So, but it's their choice. And I think as Americans and as democracies, we always want to have that moral high ground. And I think that was one of the beauties of the clean network approach, and however it gets rebranded, I think in the Biden administration, Global Trust Network, the Alliance of Democracies, the Green Dot Network, something like that. But the concept's still the same.
Yeah. So what do you think the future of the Chinese? Are we going to see a great firewall in China 10 years from now, or are they going to be forced to kind of change their approach to the internet?
Well, I think it boils down to one person, and that's General Secretary Xi. And I think he has, I think he's proven how aggressive he is. I mean, he's the emperor for life, unless the Chinese people decide he's not the right one. And I think, when we're all armchair quarterbacks, we all believe capitalism equals democracy, and we enabled, China's rise, and we were proven wrong. But I think now the world has woken up to this, and now I think what we say is you got to treat them how they are, not how we hope they would be. And it was interesting because, go to these 40 countries. I could see what was happening in the United States, but the world had woken up to what I call the Chinese Communist Party's 3 C's doctrine: concealment, co-option, and coercion. And the world understands now that this horrific pandemic is a result of the concealment of the virus. And since the world saw the co-option of Hong Kong has resulted in an evisceration of its citizens' freedoms. And now the world is beginning to know that the coercion in Xinjiang and Tibet has evolved into punishable genocide, and they don't like it. And this is also the most unifying issue on Capitol Hill. And by the way, that mere fact means a lot to our allies, and it terrifies the Chinese Communist Party. And so I think what that's done is it's given the political will to country leaders and to CEOs to stand up to that China bully. And I would say, we've all, in some way, shape, or form, have experienced bullies before. And all I know is if you confront a bully, they back down. And they really back down if you have your friends by your side. And that's what this Alliance of Democracies, this trusted network, this clean network is all about.
I really like this topic about bullies. And I think about one of the other deep thoughts that I've had in my 800 Zoom calls is we're going to get some kind of, I'm going to describe it as a partial economic divorce from China. We're not, we'll still see the kids at Thanksgiving. Maybe the spouse can come to Thanksgiving, and we'll go to the graduation together. It'll be amicable, but we're going to have a different kind of relationship going forward with mainland China. So related to that is Taiwan is a special place, is a unique place. And the U.S., I think, is partnering with Taiwan on a number of fronts and maybe ought to be doing more. And one of the things related to my 800 Zoom calls, one of the things, if we're going to get this partial economic divorce from mainland China, is we're going to rethink supply chains around the world. And so one of the things I think about is like, who are going to be the winners in, let's call it a mainland China +1 strategy, whether it's reliable partners, allied shoring, near shoring, reshoring. Talk about allied shoring, near shoring, reshoring, and also talk a little bit about how does Taiwan play into sort of this shift? Because I think we're seeing this as a result of the 3 C's you were describing.
Right, you're absolutely right, Dan. And I think the best example I can give you is something that we were able to pull off. It was really, really critical to national security, and that is Taiwan Semiconductor. They are the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing company in the world, and they make the chips that go into smartphones, 5Gs, all of that. There's only two other companies in their league. One is Samsung, which is second, and then Intel, maybe a little bit of a distant third. And so what we did, and it was within a matter of 2 weeks once we got the authorities, is we onshored Taiwan Semiconductor to manufacture in the United States. And that's critical to maintain our lead in software and software development tools for the electronic business and in equipment manufacturing and all that. The biggest onshoring in U.S. History. And when we did that, we had three theories. One was they would bring their ecosystem with us, which they did. They brought 9 of their major suppliers. They're probably, and their suppliers are probably bringing their suppliers. That's a big win. The other theory we had, because we were talking with a bunch of the semiconductor guys, is I would kind of like it be a catalyst for the other companies to come over. And indeed, that's happening. So Samsung now is building a $16 billion plant in Phoenix. The other thing is we were talking a lot with Intel. And now with Pat Gelsinger in there as a CEO, who was from VMware, who, by the way, was one of our original guys on the Clean Network. He was also on our DocuSign advisory board. He just committed $20 billion manufacturing facilities in Arizona. So that proved out to be true. The third theory we had was that it would be a catalyst for Congress to dedicate some money to bringing these companies back, because this semiconductor business was one industry we invented, we owned, and we lost it, probably because of our, we were lackadaisical, maybe we were arrogant, we didn't pay attention, and these other countries came over and they bought it from us. And the fact of the matter is, we have to buy it back, and we can't let it go. So one of the things we worked with Senator Warren and Senator Corn for the CHIPS Act, which is $30 billion act. And that got passed unanimously in the House and 96-4 in the Senate. And I think that creates a really good model. And that goes right along with the Endless Frontiers Act, that $100 billion act as well. So so the semiconductor business, which is probably the most important business to the United States industry, that lays a good example. And then, as you know, there's a lot of other supply chains that are critical. During the pandemic, we could see the pharmaceutical business, the APIs, and all those kind of things. And, I spent my first 10 years at General Motors, so I'm a manufacturing guy at heart. And, these supply chains go really, really deep. And, you've got to do it strategically. And it gets down to what product, what company, and we got to provide the incentives. And this is public-private partnership to get these companies back to the United States or back to an ally. And it requires a lot of sweat equity and money.
So I think some of these you're seeing these tectonic shifts in global supply chains as you really described, and I'm very encouraged by. Do you think it's going to impact some of our trading arrangements in terms of codifying trade, whether we got to sort of rethink some of our current trading arrangements? I'm not going to call them, in terms of some kind of new forms of trade agreements, whether they're hemispheric or with Asia or with Europe. Doesn't it have some sort of implications for sort of how we trade with each other, given some of these shifts and sort of the changing nature of technologies and supply chains?
It really does. And it actually, it gives us tools to negotiate free or fair and reciprocal trading relationships. And I think it also unifies, our relationships with the Europeans and with the Koreans and Indians and Japanese, and then the Southeast, really all around the world. And I think this is really important. And for my last 2 years in government, I didn't see a lot of U.S. companies building manufacturing capacity over there in China. And I think it's really changed because 20 years ago, labor costs were much more significant part of the equation. Now with automation, it's really about innovation is more important, and even like regional shipping costs and ability to customize very fast. So I think you're going to see a lot more of that. The big thing is it doesn't happen overnight because they're just, they're so complex, but it's really, really strategic that we do that. And it's not going to happen on its own. And there may be some sectors where we make it absolutely mandatory that you bring those supply chains into the United States. And other ones maybe just encouragement. Other ones might be fine. But, you can see all these things that are going on. I'll tell you one that's really a big concern is clean energy, particularly solar. Because if you look at what the industry experts say, that by 2050, 50 to 70% of our energy is going to come from solar. Now, 90% of the solar panels and the solar business is in China. And then there's a lot of things that people don't know. So for example, those solar panels and the polysilicon, which are the ingredients that go on these solar panels, where are they made? The vast majority of them are made in Xinjiang, the same place where, we said we're not going to buy your cotton because of genocide. Now, why are they made there? They're made there for two reasons. One is super low labor costs because they're using that forced labor, that slave labor of the Uyghurs. And so their average cost per month for a worker in the solar business is $700 a month. We can't compete with that in Europe and US. The other thing to understand is in the manufacturing of solar panels and polysilicon, it's extremely energy intensive. As a matter of fact, the energy that one solar panel puts out over 3 years is the same amount of energy that's required to manufacture it. So what's going on in Xinjiang is this is where China has their biggest coal mines. And they have the two biggest coal-fired plants for making these solar panels. And so, these are really, and they use open pit mining there. So this is, it's kind of an inconvenient truth, but people really need to know that. So the question is, this is what makes it a challenge because we all want to take action on climate change. And we have to develop our clean energy business because if we go from energy abundance to energy dependence on China, that's a national security issue. And, if there's anything that I learned, it's energy security is national security. And so this is a big dilemma. This is something that needs to be talked about. We got to put our best brains there and we got to go execute. But here again, I think you could run that clean network play on the solar business in China.
So thanks for raising that. I think one of the things that as we think about, obviously there's in the climate discussion, as we do move towards a carbon transition, many of the sorts of energy sources, solar or wind or electric vehicles, is going to require a ton more of minerals and rare earths. Someone told me that we're going to have to mine as much copper. Don't hold me to the exact statistic, but it's something like in the last 5,000 years of human history, X amount of copper has been mined. We're going to have to mine that much copper in the next 25 years to meet all the demands of either the carbon transition or batteries. So all sorts of things around critical minerals, strategic minerals, rare earths. There's been a series of bottlenecks having to do with the processing of this stuff because it's kind of dirty and it's not that, some of those minerals are not that super profitable. They're actually kind of smaller markets. If I understand it correctly, they're not that big of a business. And so, but they've got the lock on some really critical, but really small potatoes in the grand scheme of things. And we just got to rethink all that. I know you've done a lot of thinking on that.
Yeah.
How do we fix that?
Yeah, but you're absolutely right, Dan. And these critical minerals, these rare earth minerals, they're actually not that rare. You nailed it, because the issue is the processing and the processing plants. And that's where China has the stranglehold. And by the way, this was part of a 20-year plan. These were, these were the supply chains that we studied at State Department. And you could see over this 20-year history what their strategy was. It's classic. It's textbook. It's China Inc.'s plan. First of all, they shut down their internal market. So our companies that were in this business, they couldn't sell into there. And it's all about economies of scale. And then the second thing they do is they start subsidizing, and they drive down the price. So then you have these U.S. and also like German companies that they're public companies. They're on the 90-day shot clock, and that makes it tough. And so it's like, well, it's not that profitable. We can't invest for the long term. They get in trouble. Then here comes China buying these companies up. They also, obviously, there's a lot of intellectual property theft, all those kind of things. And then they just keep knocking it out. So, all of a sudden you're in a position where it's like, well, China owns the rare earth and critical minerals. I mean, and this happened in polysilicon business. And polysilicon, as I mentioned, is made in Xinjiang, energy intensive. And 90% of the polysilicon goes into solar panels, 10% goes into semiconductors. And we only have one manufacturer in the United States that, and it's a small company and right in Michigan. And so this is something that, here again, it's public and private sector, because the demand for these are going to go up, and it's critical so that we can solve the climate change problem.
So I think about, let me just say, if I say Canada and Australia, if I kind of word associate in this rare earths thing or critical minerals thing, I think of Canada and Australia. Can you just sort of react to that?
Yeah. So, by the way, this is one of the things that we did, and I give a lot of credit to my assistant secretary for energy, Frank Fannin.
He's an affiliate of CSIS, may I add.
He is.
Guy. Yep.
I'll tell you got a great winner there. He's a superstar and just one heck of a human being. And so what he did is he created the Energy Research Governance Initiative. We nicknamed it ERGI. Basically, you could look at it as a clean minerals initiative. And he got same principles. So he got about 20 countries, and Canada and Australia are amongst those. He also got a number of South American and African nations where they have the minerals. So it's principle driven again, and not just the principles that I mentioned before, but also from a standpoint of governance and also environmental practices. And so, if you force the Chinese, China Inc. to do that, it's going to raise their costs. So, a way to look at it, a great analogy for this mineral business is blood diamonds. I mean, we shut that down.
Yep.
And that analogy is true. I mean, to a fair extent, in some of these areas, they're really blood minerals.
No, totally. So, all right, let me turn. So one of the things I got religion on in the last several years is the multilateral system, and your job touched some really key multilateral institutions. A lot of these institutions are not appreciated in Washington. They've got like funny names, If you go online and look at them, there's lots of technocratic gobbledygook about what the heck these things are. So I got religion on this on the WIPO race, which if you'd put a gun to my head 3 years ago and said, Dan, what's WIPO? And I'm a pretty well-read guy. I'm a pretty well-traveled guy. I had no idea what the heck WIPO was.
Right.
It's like the Major League Baseball Commission of Patents and intellectual property. And if Keith and Dan came up with a new widget, you send the blueprint to the Patent and Trade Office, and they send the blueprint to Geneva. And then the Geneva folks declare this is actually unique intellectual property, and it sits in a virtual filing cabinet. And then if someone got control of the virtual filing cabinet, that would be really bad if the wrong people got control of that virtual filing cabinet, right? That's basically what the issue was.
Right.
So there was nothing in the world 2 years ago when that race was happening. And we'd lost a couple of races because I think for the last 20 years, we got a little bit lazy, a little bit to your point about some other stuff in the world. I thought, well, we could just kind of throw our weight around, and people are getting much better. They're going out and doing push-ups and working with a personal trainer to us in the multilateral system.
Yeah.
And they beat us a couple times, and they said, whoa. And then we could not lose this WIPO thing, but there have been some other things too. So we've got.
And by the way, you're right. Here's what was interesting, right? This is like the world's intellectual property. And so wouldn't this be a great one for the Chinese to control, right? And what was interesting was when I came in the government, I said, because everybody said, hey, there's this election going on. I go, this is really important. What's the strategy? Obviously, there's a strategic plan. It's like you've got your buddies running for president student body in college. You got a game plan, don't you? And it was like, we've never really done that before. And I'm like, you're kidding me. And so we ended up doing it, and it was a real great team effort. And what it did is it proved three things. Well, first of all, we got the right candidate. Okay.
Oh yeah, absolutely. This gentleman from Singapore is great.
And the second thing is we proved that if you have a strategy and you execute, you can make it happen. The third thing that happened was actually unifying with our allies. It really was. And in the leadership 101 is people support, they help create, right? So it's a team effort. But one thing and that's always in the business world, but one thing that's a little bit different tweak, I think, in the in global diplomacy, is that these countries are waiting for the United States to lead. They want us to lead. They need us to lead. And a lot of it gets back to that intimidation, retaliation. And so we played a great leadership role. And so here again, I think this is a great formula, and I'm pretty confident now it'll be institutionalized at the State Department. And so we've got to win these things. And when I say win, it doesn't have to be an American. It's just, it's got to be somebody we can work with, somebody who's friendly.
Somebody we can work with. That's a great way to describe it. Yeah. When I went out there, so I think if you asked the 435 members of Congress, and these are very hardworking, educated, thoughtful people, what WIPO was, I'm guessing 2 or 3 years ago, I'm guessing maybe 5 or 10 knew what it is. And it's not, I don't think this is there's like 200. So I went out and figured this out. There's like 200 of these big multilateral organizations, of which we're members of about 110. And about 20 of them are really, really key. There are sort of like the commanding heights of the multilateral system that we got to like really, really watch. So once a year, one of these things comes up, either for a reelect or an open seat. And we got to just focus. We got to get way ahead of time. We got to be ahead, a year ahead. We got to have a game plan, everything you're saying. So one of them, to the Biden administration's credit, is they came out a couple of weeks ago and said, we, the United States, are going to support for the first time, or for many, many years, it's been something like 70 years, an American candidate to run something called the ITU. Now, Keith, you know what the ITU is, and it's a first woman candidate, and we hope she wins. Her name is Doreen Bogdan-Martin. Bipartisan support across the aisle in Washington, United States. She's a great, great candidate. I hosted her for a podcast about a month ago. She's a superstar. Could you tell, why is the ITU important? Why is that an important institution?
Well, the International Telecommunications Union is about 150 years old, and it's committed to connecting all the world's people. So this is an important one. And it's kind of a specialized agency in the United Nations, and it's critical. I mean, it was definitely critical, right, for 5G, but this whole thing that we were talking about in terms of the rules of the road and all that for the internet and reciprocal data flows and making sure that you have those core principles.
So they're like the Major League Baseball Commission.
And they set standards. And see what's been going on is the Chinese have been going into these organizations and they've been trying to control the standards. And here's why it's important. So a guy like me in practice economic warcraft, here's the equivalent is setting the ground rules for a game. And if you can set the ground rules for the game, then you can actually tilt the table in your favor. It's like when you're playing pool and you're the only guy that knows it's tilted this way, and so that is that's key. And so with these standards, and by the way, this is where the trust principles from the Clean Network come in, is that they should provide an umbrella over what I call the nuts and bolts standards. So that, in other words, you could have all the nuts and bolts standards you want, China, but if you don't adhere to the trust principles, like if you steal intellectual property, or if you don't have rule of law, forget it. This supersedes it. And I think that's the jujitsu move, I think, for the games that China's playing. And they've almost taken over the United Nations. I mean, they're all over the World Bank, all these places. And these are institutions that the United States built based on fair play. And so, I think we're all free traders.
We just got to up our game.
Yeah. And, when somebody comes in, free trade, when somebody comes in the market and they don't play by the rules, the market is no longer free and you've got to do something about it. And as you know, they've taken advantage of the WTO to the max. So there's, and I think you're going to see much more United States leadership, and is really welcome in these multilateral organizations. Because the fact of the matter is, we don't have even the bandwidth to do everything unilateral. So it's about time to reinsert ourselves.
Great. Keith, I'm coming away very optimistic about the future, as long as we have a bipartisan consensus and we keep that. And I think a lot of the things you were doing, and really enjoyed a strong bipartisan consensus. I have a feeling a lot of it is carrying over. So I suspect you're sharing my optimism that if we just hold this bipartisan consensus, we're going to be okay.
Do. By the way, I totally do. And, I'm meeting with a number of the administration folks talking about this stuff. I mean, this is, look, we're one team. And I think it's really
Team America.
By the way, it is Team America, and it's Team Democracy too, right? So that's the magic formula, because we can't beat them on our own. But I think also an important thing to keep in mind is the clock is ticking, and it's not the big that's going to eat the small. It's going to be the fast that eats the slow. And I can tell you, this is one of those things when you think about our grandchildren, our great grandchildren, success will need no explanation and failure will need no alibi. Failure is not an option, and we've got to do it. And we've got to be united.
But we can do this.
We can do this. We can do it. And we proved it. And we've got a model, and we can rebrand it, improve it, whatever. But that's what the United States is good on. We build on top of things that have gone in the past. But at the same time, those democratic values, those trust principles, that's the secret. and we've had them used against us. Now we have to use those to our advantage.
Keith, this has been great. I'm going to have you back. So 18 months from now, we're going to,
Okay.
I hope, but we're going to revisit this because I agree. I share your optimism. I'm renewed in my optimism speaking with you. Thanks for taking the time today, Keith. This is great. And let's keep talking. Thanks a lot for doing this.
Thank you, Dan. All the best. I really, really appreciate it. You take care.
Thanks, Keith.
Bye-bye.